The train creaked to a halt, its metal groaning as if protesting the stop. I stepped onto the platform, the thick fog swirling around my ankles, cold and damp like a shroud. The station was almost deserted, save for a few shadowy figures hunched against the cold. The night was quiet, unnaturally so. The only sound was the distant hum of the engine as it cooled. I boarded the train with a sense of unease gnawing at me. This wasn't my first undercover assignment, but something about this night felt different, off. The carriage was dimly lit, casting long, flickering shadows that danced on the worn upholstery. As I walked down the narrow aisle, my footsteps seemed too loud, echoing in the silence. The passengers were an odd mix, a middle-aged couple whispering in hushed tones, a man in a dark overcoat staring out the window with an intensity that made me uneasy, a young woman clutching her purse as if it held her very soul. They all looked like they had stories, secrets buried deep within, and I was here to unearth one of them. Taking a seat near the back, I let my gaze wander, my senses alert to anything unusual. The air was thick with tension, a quiet anxiety that seemed to hang over everyone like a heavy curtain. I could feel it, that creeping sense of dread that came before something terrible. But for now, the train rolled on, its wheels clattering against the tracks, heading into the unknown night. As the landscape outside the window began to blur into a dark smear of shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that once this train left the station, there was no going back. The train moved steadily through the night, its rhythm almost lulling, but there was an undercurrent of something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I tried to focus, to stay sharp, but the soft clattering of the wheels seemed to pull at my thoughts, dragging them into the darkness outside. Then it started. At first, it was subtle. A man in the seat ahead of me stood up to stretch his legs. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps soft, disappearing into the next car. Minutes passed, and he didn't return. I noted it, but didn't think much of it. People wandered on trains, after all. But then, another passenger, an elderly woman who had been knitting quietly, rose with a sigh. She gathered her things, shuffling down the aisle. She too vanished into the adjoining car. Time ticked by, the minutes stretching into an uneasy silence. The passengers around me seemed to shrink into themselves, eyes darting nervously. I began to count the empty seats. 2, 3, 5. The couple across from me exchanged anxious glances, their voices barely whispers. They were afraid, and now, so was I. The train's lights flickered, just for a second, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. When they stabilized, another seat was empty, its occupant gone without a sound. My pulse quickened. I stood, moving towards the front of the car, glancing into each seat as I passed. No one spoke, but the fear was palpable, thick in the air like smoke. Where were they going? How could they just disappear? There were no stops, no announcements, just the relentless forward motion of the train and the passengers, one by one, slipping away into nothingness. I reached the door to the next car, hesitant to open it. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as I grasped the handle. There was something deeply wrong, something unnatural about this place, this train. And as I hesitated, the lights flickered again. When they steadied, I turned back and saw another seat empty. The couple who had been whispering now gone as if they had never been there at all. The car was almost empty now. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it nearly drowning out the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. I wasn't sure what I would find beyond the door, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward, had to find out where everyone was going before I too vanished into the dark. I pushed through the door to the next car, the metal handle cold against my palm. As the door slid open, I was met with a blast of icy air that stole the breath from my lungs. The car was dimmer than the last, the lights barely illuminating the interior, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The first thing I noticed was the window. It was no longer showing the familiar blur of passing landscapes. Instead, it displayed an expanse of darkness so absolute that it seemed to swallow the train whole. There was nothing outside. No moon, no stars, no distant lights, just an endless void that pressed against the glass, threatening to seep inside. I moved cautiously through the car, my eyes darting to the seats. They were all empty now, every single one. I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread curling in my stomach, the feeling that I was no longer in the world I knew. I reached the end of the car and peered out the window into the corridor that led to the next carriage. It too was empty, and beyond it, the darkness was thicker, more oppressive, as if the night itself had become a tangible, suffocating force. The train was no longer on its scheduled route. I was sure of it. This wasn't the same journey I had embarked on. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced back down the car, half expecting the empty seats to be filled with ghostly figures, but they remained barren, lifeless. The only sound was the relentless clatter of the wheels, but even that seemed more distant, more detached, as if the train were slowly drifting away from reality. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to find some explanation, but every step forward felt like I was sinking deeper into a nightmare. I pressed on, opening the door to the next car, but it was as if the train was pulling me further from the world I knew, dragging me into some dark, alternate reality where the rules were no longer the same. As I crossed into the next car, the darkness outside seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. The temperature dropped further, and the lights flickered again, weaker this time, struggling to stay lit. And that's when I saw it, a shadow moving just at the edge of the light, too fast to fully see, but there nonetheless. Something was out there, in the void beyond the windows, something watching, waiting. The train wasn't just off course. It was on a journey to somewhere else, a place where the darkness was alive and the boundaries of reality were paper thin. And I was trapped on board, hurtling toward whatever lay in wait beyond the veil of night. The train car felt colder now, the air heavy with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creaking of the metal and the distant, rhythmic clatter of the wheels, now sounding more like a heartbeat, a slow, ominous pulse that echoed through the empty car. I felt the darkness outside pressing against the windows, as if it wanted to seep in, to swallow me whole. I moved forward, each step more tentative than the last. My breath hung in the air, visible, as if the cold had crept inside me. I knew I wasn't alone, not really. Something was here, something unseen but felt, lurking just beyond the edge of perception. And then, the nightmares began. It started subtly, almost like a whisper at the back of my mind. Memories, long buried, began to surface, moments I had tried to forget, fears I had buried deep within. The train itself seemed to amplify them, drawing them out, making them real. The shadows in the corners of the car shifted, taking on forms that were all too familiar, all too terrifying. I saw her, just at the edge of my vision, a figure from my past, her eyes hollow, her face pale and lifeless. My chest tightened with fear as she moved closer, her steps soundless, her presence a cold weight pressing down on me. She was a specter of my guilt, a ghost of a mistake I had tried to bury, and now she was here, tangible, real. The other passengers, or what was left of them, were no different. They were trapped in their own nightmares, their faces contorted in fear, their eyes wide with terror as they faced whatever haunted them. The young woman from before was curled up in her seat, her eyes fixed on something only she could see, her lips trembling as she whispered to herself, over and over, words I couldn't understand. The train wasn't just a vessel anymore. It had become a gateway, a passage into our deepest fears, dragging us into a realm where our nightmares could manifest, could hurt us. My heartbeat quickened, the terror rising as I struggled to separate reality from the twisted visions that now surrounded me. I could feel my sanity slipping, the line between what was real and what wasn't blurring with each passing moment. The train was moving faster now, the pulse of the wheels more urgent, as if driving us deeper into this nightmarish dimension. And through it all, that shadow, the one I had glimpsed earlier, seemed to grow closer, more distinct, as if it was feeding on our fear, growing stronger with each passing second. I had to fight it, had to hold on to whatever scraps of reality I could. But the darkness was relentless, the cold unyielding, and the train, this cursed, infernal train, was dragging me, dragging all of us, toward a place where escape was impossible, where the only way out was to confront the very nightmares we had spent our lives running from. The train hurtled forward, faster now, as if it were racing against time itself. The darkness outside pressed tighter, a suffocating shroud that blocked out all light, all hope. The nightmare had fully taken hold, and I could feel its grip tightening around my mind, squeezing until I thought I might shatter. Then, as if answering some unspoken call, the train slowed, the wheels screeching as they ground against the tracks. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the car into near darkness, leaving only the dim glow from the emergency lights. And in that suffocating gloom, I saw it. A door at the far end of the car, one that hadn't been there before. It was old, weathered, its wood cracked and splintered, as if it had been dragged from another time, another place. My heart pounded as I approached it, the air growing colder with each step. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the door was a portal, a threshold to something far worse than the nightmares that had plagued me so far. I reached out with a trembling hand, my fingers brushing the rough surface of the wood. The moment I touched it, a flood of memories surged through me. Flashes of faces, voices, moments of pain and regret that I had buried deep within. This door, this cursed door, was tied to it all, the source of the train's power, the heart of this twisted reality. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. This wasn't just a random haunting, some curse of the past. The train was feeding off us, dragging us deeper into this nightmare world, one fueled by our own fears, our own regrets. And the only way out, the only way to stop it, was through that door. I hesitated, fear clawing at my throat. What lay beyond it? What horrors awaited me on the other side? But I knew I had no choice. The train was pulling us all to a point of no return, and I had to face whatever was behind that door if I wanted to have any hope of escaping. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The door creaked, its hinges groaning in protest, and what I saw on the other side froze me in place. It was a room, a small, dimly lit space, filled with the remnants of a life long gone. Photographs, trinkets, and a mirror, old and cracked, reflecting a version of myself that I barely recognized. But it wasn't the objects that held my attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room, bathed in the faint light of a single flickering bulb. It was me, or rather, a twisted, distorted version of me. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of all the fear, anger, and guilt I had ever felt. He smiled, a cruel, mocking grin that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think you can escape?" he whispered, his voice a harsh rasp. "This is where it ends, where it always ends. You can't outrun your past. You can't escape yourself." I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The room closed in around me, the walls seeming to breathe, to pulse with a life of their own. The train's pulse quickened, matching the frantic beating of my heart. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it terrified me. The figure stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. I had to confront him, confront myself. If I wanted to survive this, if I wanted to free myself and the others trapped on this cursed train. But as I reached out, the room began to twist and warp, the walls closing in, the darkness seeping into every corner. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The figure lunged, and everything went black. When the darkness lifted, I was no longer on the train. I found myself standing on a desolate platform, the night air thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. The station was empty, abandoned, the edges of the platform crumbling into nothingness, as if it were suspended over an abyss. I looked around, disoriented, my mind still reeling from what I had seen in that room, from the confrontation with my own twisted reflection. The train was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. But the memories, the terror, were still fresh, clinging to me like a second skin. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The platform seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking me further from the familiar, deeper into a world that felt utterly alien. But as I walked, I noticed something strange, a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the thick haze. Desperate for any sign of life, I moved towards it. The closer I got, the more the light grew, until it illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the platform. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized him. It was the same twisted version of myself I had confronted on the train, but this time, he wasn't grinning. He was just standing there, staring into the void beyond the platform's edge, his expression unreadable. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something else, Behind him, just barely visible in the gloom, was the train. It was waiting, its engine humming softly, the doors open as if inviting me back inside. But this train wasn't the same. It was different now, more solid, more real, as if it had fully crossed over into this strange new world. The figure turned to face me, his eyes, my eyes, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Sorrow? A plea for help? He didn't speak, but I understood. This was the choice, the final decision that would determine my fate. I could step onto that train, let it take me wherever it was meant to go, or I could turn back, walk away from this nightmare, and try to find another way out. But as I stood there, torn between the two paths, the realization hit me like a cold wave. The train was never meant to be escaped. It was a cycle, an endless loop where each passenger was doomed to confront their own demons over and over again until they were consumed by them. And the only way to break that cycle was to refuse the choice entirely. I turned away from the figure, away from the train. The platform beneath me began to tremble, the edges crumbling faster now, the void creeping closer. But I kept walking, forcing myself forward, away from the light, away from the darkness. The sound of the train's engine grew fainter, the hum turning into a distant echo, until it was swallowed by the silence. Then, just as the last piece of the platform began to dissolve beneath my feet, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the endless night and the faint glimmer of light in the distance, the same light I had seen when I first arrived. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I stepped forward into the darkness, feeling the ground give way beneath me. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt free. The train, the figures, the twisted reflections, they were all behind me now, fading into memory as I fell into the void. And as the darkness enveloped me, I realized the truth. The nightmare wasn't the train or the journey. It was the choice, the endless torment of facing the same horrors, the same fears, over and over again. But by walking away, by rejecting the path laid out for me, I had broken free. The void wasn't a punishment. It was a release. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take me. And as I did, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that, in the end, the only way to escape the nightmare was to surrender to it completely. The last thing I heard before everything faded to black was the distant, haunting whistle of the train as it continued its endless journey without me.